In a packed university lecture hall, tension crackles in the air as Professor Daniel Hawthorne, a well-known liberal academic, smirks at his podium. His target? Karoline Leavitt, a young, confident conservative voice who refuses to back down. With the entire class watching, he delivers a sharp, cutting remark, dismissing her views with a condescending laugh. The room erupts in murmurs, some amused, others uncomfortable. But Karoline doesn't flinch. The moment is electric, a collision of ideologies playing out before stunned students. Eyes dart between the professor and Karoline, waiting to see if she'll retreat in humiliation or rise to the challenge. And then, with unwavering poise, she speaks. What she says next leaves the entire room in stunned silence. No one saw it coming, not the professor, not the students, and certainly not those who underestimated her. Stay tuned, because this debate is about to take a turn that no one will forget. Before we get into today's story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Now, let's get started. The lecture hall buzzed with idle chatter, the low hum of students shifting in their seats, blending with the occasional tapping of fingers against keyboards. The scent of stale coffee and old textbooks lingered in the air, mingling with the crisp autumn breeze sneaking in through a cracked window. Fluorescent lights cast a sterile glow over the sea of expectant faces, all waiting for the professor to begin. Karoline sat near the front, her back straight, fingers lightly gripping the edge of her desk. She could feel the subtle glances thrown her way. Some curious, others skeptical. It wasn't the first time she had been the center of attention in a room like this, and it likely wouldn't be the last. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. Stay composed, stay sharp. She had learned long ago that in academic settings like these, her views weren't just debated, they were scrutinized, picked apart, dismissed before she even had the chance to defend them. Today would be no different. Her stomach twisted slightly at the thought, but she quickly shoved the feeling aside. She had come prepared. Professor Hawthorne, dressed in his usual tweed blazer and smug demeanor, paced at the front of the room, his eyes scanning the crowd with the confidence of a man who had long controlled the narrative here. His voice, smooth, yet laced with condescension, carried across the hall as he began the lecture. Before we dive into today's topic, let's address something interesting from last class, he said, pausing for effect. His gaze landed on Karoline, a flicker of amusement dancing in his eyes. Miss Leavitt here had quite the bold take on economic policy, didn't she? A few students chuckled. Others turned in their seats, eager to witness the brewing confrontation. Karoline's jaw tightened, but she forced a polite smile, even as heat crept up her neck. Here we go. The air in the room grew thick with anticipation. The weight of expectation pressed against her chest, not just from the students, but from herself. She knew this wasn't just about a classroom debate. It was about something bigger, about standing her ground in a space that often sought to silence people like her. Her fingers relaxed their grip on the desk. If the professor wanted a spectacle, he was about to get one. Professor Hawthorne clasped his hands behind his back, his smirk widening as he turned to the class. Miss Leavitt, since you were so adamant about your stance last time, perhaps you'd like to enlighten us again. Tell us why, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary, you believe your perspective holds weight. The air in the lecture hall thickened. Some students exchanged glances, others stifled smirks, and a few simply leaned in, sensing an impending intellectual bloodbath. Karoline's pulse quickened. She had anticipated pushback, but not like this, not a deliberate public challenge laced with ridicule. She swallowed the flare of indignation rising in her throat and met the professor's gaze evenly. With all due respect, Professor, I'd be happy to clarify my points if the goal is an actual discussion rather than a public dismissal. A few murmurs rippled through the class. Professor Hawthorne's eyes flickered with something, perhaps amusement, perhaps irritation. "Oh, my dear," he said, waving a hand dismissively. "Discussion requires credibility. It's not about feelings, it's about facts. And, unfortunately, when one lacks the credentials to interpret complex socio-economic structures properly, their opinion remains just that, an uninformed opinion." Laughter, not from everyone, but enough to sting. The moment punctured the thin veil of academic professionalism, exposing what this really was, an attempt to humiliate her. A sharp pang of frustration coursed through Karoline's chest, but she forced herself to breathe. Don't react emotionally. Stay in control. She had spent years navigating spaces where people like her, young, outspoken, conservative, were treated as intellectual inferiors. She had developed armor. But this was an ambush, not a debate. She could feel the heat of the moment pressing down on her, threatening to smother the calm exterior she fought to maintain. Her mind raced, not with self-doubt, but with the weight of choice. She could shrink, let this moment pass, laugh it off like others did when cornered. Or she could fight back. Slowly, she leaned forward, her voice measured. "So just to be clear, Professor, the foundation of your argument isn't to engage with my points, but to dismiss them outright because I don't share your credentials? Or is it because I don't share your ideology?" Silence. Professor Hawthorne's smirk faltered for just a second. He hadn't expected resistance. At least, not effective resistance. The tension in the room shifted from amusement to intrigue, the balance of power tilting ever so slightly. Karoline felt the moment shift. The battle lines had been drawn. Now it was time to see how far the professor was willing to go. Professor Hawthorne's smirk returned, but this time there was an edge to it. He stepped away from the podium, his voice taking on a condescending lilt. "Oh, Karoline," he said, drawing out her name like a teacher scolding a misbehaving child. "Your enthusiasm is commendable, but you see, academia isn't about ideology. It's about intellectual rigor. And unfortunately, rigor isn't found in the talking points of partisan blogs or cable news segments." A few students chuckled. Some nodded in agreement. Others sat frozen, eyes darting between the professor and Karoline, sensing the tension rising like a storm cloud about to break. Karoline felt a slow, burning anger coil inside her chest, but she couldn't let it take control. She had watched this tactic before. Bait, ridicule, discredit. She wasn't about to play into it. Instead, she exhaled and squared her shoulders. "With all due respect, Professor, questioning someone's credibility based on preconceived notions rather than engaging with their actual argument isn't rigor, it's intellectual laziness." The murmurs grew louder. A few students raised their brows, clearly impressed. Others shifted uncomfortably in their seats, sensing the debate had taken an unexpected turn. Professor Hawthorne's smirk flickered, but he recovered quickly. "Fascinating," he mused, crossing his arms. "Then by all means, enlighten us. Defend your position. Show us how your argument holds up under scrutiny." Karoline took a deep breath. This was it. If she backed down, she'd become another name on his list of students who tried and failed. But if she stood firm, if she articulated her stance without faltering, she might just turn the tables. She straightened, her voice calm yet unwavering. "All right, let's talk about it." She began, not by attacking, but by carefully laying out her argument, point by point, backed by statistics, historical precedent, and logical reasoning. Every word was deliberate, every claim supported. She wasn't playing defense, she was making her case. The room, once buzzing with quiet amusement, grew silent. Some students leaned in, intrigued. Others, who had already written her off, now found themselves listening. Professor Hawthorne, however, was not about to let her steal the spotlight. He leaned forward, his tone sharper now. "Cherry-picked data," he interjected. "Classic mistake. You're drawing conclusions that don't account for the full scope of the issue. That's the problem with ideological arguments. You take partial truths and try to frame them as objective reality." Karoline met his gaze head-on. "That's an interesting critique, Professor, considering you haven't refuted any of my actual points. You've only dismissed them." A collective oof rippled through the lecture hall. Someone muttered, "Damn." Professor Hawthorne's jaw tightened. "And that's exactly the problem," he countered, his voice now carrying the weight of frustration. "People like you—" He stopped himself, but the words hung in the air. "People like you?" There it was. The slip, the mask cracking. The shift was immediate. Some students stiffened, others exchanged knowing glances. Karoline seized the moment. She didn't need to raise her voice or feign outrage. Instead, she let the silence do the work for her. Then, with an almost serene clarity, she spoke. "That," she said, tilting her head slightly, "sounds an awful lot like bias, Professor." The room erupted. Laughter, gasps, whispers. The power dynamic had officially shifted. Professor Hawthorne opened his mouth, then closed it. He had underestimated her, and now everyone knew it. A heavy silence settled over the lecture hall, thick with the weight of what had just happened. Professor Hawthorne, who had spent years molding the class dynamic to suit his authority, now stood rigid behind his podium. His carefully curated smirk had faded, replaced by something Karoline couldn't quite name. Frustration, embarrassment, fear. And then the realization hit her. This wasn't just about a debate. It wasn't about who was right or wrong. It was about control, about expectation, about the unwritten rule that students were meant to absorb, not challenge. She had unknowingly stepped onto a battlefield, and against all odds, she had won. Her heart pounded in her chest, a mix of adrenaline and disbelief. The moment should have been terrifying, but instead it felt electric. Professor Hawthorne inhaled sharply through his nose, forcing a tight-lipped smile. "Well," he said, finally, his voice measured, "it seems Miss Leavitt has given us quite the spirited discussion today." The words were meant to dismiss her, to downplay what had just happened. But it was too late. The class had seen it. They had felt it. A student in the back clapped, slow at first, uncertain, then another, and another. The sound swelled, rippling through the lecture hall in a way Karoline had never expected. She looked around, stunned. It wasn't just the usual supporters nodding along. Even those who had laughed at the professor's jabs earlier were now watching her, with something different in their eyes. Respect, curiosity, and that's when it clicked. This wasn't just her moment. It was their moment. The moment when a student, an underdog, challenged, The authority meant to belittle her and didn't just survive, but thrived. She had changed something. Professor Hawthorne cleared his throat, his fingers gripping the podium like an anchor. "That's enough," he said, voice tight. "Let's move on." But the shift had already happened. The lecture hall wasn't the same. The power wasn't just his anymore. Karoline sat back down, exhaling slowly, her hands still trembling slightly from the rush. She had walked into that classroom expecting another day of barely concealed hostility. She was walking out with something else, entirely. Victory. The energy in the lecture hall lingered long after class had ended. Students whispered as they gathered their things, exchanging glances that carried the weight of an unspoken shift. Some approached Karoline with nods of approval, quiet acknowledgements of what had just transpired. Others, still wary, kept their distance, their expressions unreadable, but the moment had already planted itself in their minds. It was undeniable. Karoline remained in her seat for a moment, her fingers tracing the edge of her notebook as she processed what had happened. For so long, she had felt like an outsider in this space, like her voice was nothing more than an inconvenience in a room where dissent wasn't welcomed. But today was different. She had spoken, she had stood her ground, and the world hadn't collapsed around her. "Hey!" A voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see Ethan, a classmate who had never really interacted with her before, shifting awkwardly in place. "That was—" He paused, as if searching for the right word. "Brave." She let out a small breath of amusement. "Brave or reckless?" He smirked. "Maybe both?" A beat passed before he added, "But necessary." Karoline studied his face, noting the sincerity in his expression. She had expected backlash, maybe even isolation. But instead, she was seeing something new. Respect, curiosity, maybe even admiration. Across the room, Professor Hawthorne was gathering his papers, his movements stiff, with barely contained frustration. He didn't look at her. He didn't acknowledge what had happened, but his silence spoke volumes. The power dynamic had shifted, and he knew it. As she finally stood and slung her bag over her shoulder, another student, one who had laughed along with the professor earlier, hesitated before speaking. "I never really thought about it that way," she admitted, eyes darting to the ground. "But you made a good point." Karoline felt something settle inside her, something solid and unwavering. "Thanks," she said simply. Stepping out into the hallway, she felt the weight on her shoulders lessen. The fear of speaking up, of being ridiculed, of being wrong. It wasn't gone entirely, but it no longer controlled her. For the first time, she wasn't just a student sitting at a desk, quietly absorbing what was being fed to her. She was a force, and she wasn't done yet. As Karoline walked through the campus courtyard, the crisp autumn air carried the faint hum of conversations around her. But this time, she wasn't drowning in the noise. She wasn't shrinking under the weight of expectations or assumptions. She was standing taller, her steps lighter, not because she had won an argument, but because she had reclaimed something that had been slipping away from her for too long. Her own voice. For years, she had been told to be careful, to pick her battles, to know when to stay silent. But today, she had learned something different. The power of her words wasn't in how loudly she spoke or how many people agreed with her. It was in the truth she refused to compromise. She pulled out her phone and saw a message from her father. "Proud of you," simple, but it meant everything. Pausing for a moment, she glanced back at the lecture hall doors. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she faced resistance, nor would it be the last time someone tried to diminish her for her beliefs. But now, she was ready. Not just to defend herself, but to challenge, to inspire, to make others think. A breeze rustled the golden leaves around her feet, and she smiled. This was just the beginning. Karoline sat alone in the quiet of her dorm room, the weight of the day pressing down on her. The confrontation had been intense, unexpected, and in many ways unfair. But as she replayed the moment in her mind, something surprising happened. She didn't feel anger anymore. She didn't feel small. She felt stronger. For so long, she had been careful, always measuring her words, always worried about how she would be perceived. But today, she had spoken without fear. She had stood her ground, not with rage or defensiveness, but with conviction. And the most shocking part? People had listened. Even those who had scoffed at her in the beginning had quieted by the end. She had seen it in their eyes, the shift, the uncertainty, the realization that maybe, just maybe, they had misjudged her. She exhaled deeply, leaning back against her chair, staring out the window. The city lights flickered in the distance, a reminder of the world outside, the world she was stepping into. She knew this wouldn't be the last time she would be challenged. It wouldn't be the last time someone would try to reduce her to a stereotype, dismiss her with a smug remark. But now she was ready, not just to defend herself, but to challenge, to inspire, to force others to think beyond their biases. Her phone buzzed, a message from a classmate she barely knew. "I didn't agree with you at first, but you made me think." Respect, a small smile formed on her lips. This wasn't about winning or losing. It was about having a voice, about standing firm in who she was. And for the first time in a long time, she felt unstoppable. Karoline's story isn't just about one debate. It's about the power of standing firm in your beliefs, even when the odds are stacked against you. In a world where people are quick to judge and even quicker to dismiss opposing views, having the courage to speak up with confidence and clarity is rare. But moments like these prove that words have power, that logic, reason, and conviction can shift perspectives, even when faced with hostility. So now, we turn the question to you. Have you ever been in a situation where someone tried to silence you or make you feel small for your beliefs? How did you respond? Do you think respectful debate can truly change minds, or is the divide too deep? Let us know in the comments. We want to hear your thoughts.